My work is really about a very personal experience of being alive at this period of time. But it also touches on really big contemporary issues, such as power structures, issues of control, societal structures, our relationships with technology, with ecology, and with nature. The work interrogates and describes those kinds of relationships, but also simultaneously reflects on the human condition, the brevity and fragility of life itself, on what is given value and worth, what kinds of things are memorialised, and the inevitable experiences of love and grief. I'm Emma Talbot and I'm an artist, and I'm based in London. I make paintings on silk, I make animation, I make drawings, I make three-dimensional work. But all of them are part of the same language that describes a personal way of telling the stories of our times. First of all, I was really interested in trying to make art that somehow mirrored the way that we think. And the way we think is so layered and multiple that we can be concentrating on something while we have an emotional response and be thinking about something else that is triggered by, whatever we're concentrating on. So I developed a practice in which I start with drawing, and I let myself draw whatever comes to mind without really trying to direct, the subject of the drawings or what they're exploring, so that I can see what it is I'm thinking. And it sort of leans on a practice of listening in to things, just fleeting thoughts, and not judging whether, something is more important than something else. And sometimes those drawings could be text, they could be sort of almost written. And sometimes they're images, sometimes they're quite abstract, but they seem to be a way to see ideas or thoughts. And then after a while, if I have a group of drawings, I can see there's a subject that's emerging. So I have an intuitive sense, and maybe I have a very sort of visual way of describing an idea. Then I do a lot of research, online or reading, or really trying to fill in other types of knowledge. What I'm trying to do is just put together how we understand things. But it's a very sort of personal direction, because it really is based on what attracts my interest. For example, recently I wanted to describe the beginning of all our lives, which is, the moment that an egg is fertilized. I could imagine what that would be like and how I would want to depict that. But I had to do a lot of research to look at, what does an egg look like? What are all the parts of the egg? What's the scientific term for this? How does fertilization happen? So then I realized that there's a spark of light that emits when the sperm enters the egg, because zinc is released. And then that closes the egg so another sperm couldn't enter it. And that type of information for me is something that I have to research in order to find those moments, those things that really interest me, because I know that will become something that's part of an image that I make, because that for me is a kind of fantastic way to describe something that we all experience, without being able to see it maybe, but it's a part of our life. And then I guess to make a big painted hanging is a kind of collage of a lot of those ideas that surround a kind of central theme. The starting point for paintings tends to be a white rectangle. And I really wanted to find an equivalent to making drawings on paper, on handmade paper, which had a lot of materials in it, like bits of bark or leaf. I'd been making some paintings on raw canvas that was sealed. And I felt that there was a restriction with a stretcher being a rectangle. I thought of it in relation to a writer like Hélène Cixous, when she wrote the essay Coming to Writing. She wrote, how should I write? Do I have a right to write? And she wrote about finding your own voice through writing, in her case. And I sort of applied it to making art because I thought I don't want the painting to be within this format, which seems, as if it's too many decisions have already been made and it's kind of heavy with a history. And then I wanted something really, really light. And it just struck me one day that, silk, I could use silk. I could try it. And also why I thought of that was that I thought you could drape it, you could hang it, you could cut it, you could shape it, you could wear it, you could, I felt like it was really flexible. I felt a connection with it and that it wasn't hard. And there was something about its softness and the immediacy with which I would paint that felt like it really was similar to making a drawing on paper. And also I felt like it was a sort of language of my own that I could, sort of believe in. When I was figuring out how to paint on silk, I thought, I think you have to use fabric dye. Well, actually, that doesn't work. To paint. You have to find a really particular balance between things being very fluid and things being a sort of strong enough substance that you can draw a line, or you flood the area with something more washy. You're in control of how you make those marks on the surface and how the colour is contained in areas. It's a very sort of particular way of painting. There's something quite nicely intuitive about the relationship that I have with the surface. It's probably one of the strongest natural materials, but it's very delicate. And I just know how to do what I want to do with it by now. But it is a lot of responding to a material, to be able to paint on them. One of the first largest works that I made on silk was for the Freud Museum, and I was making a painting in relation to Freud's writings about dreams. And I took down the curtain in the dining room of the Freud Museum because the museum is what was Freud's house. So I asked if I could take down the curtain and replace it with a painted hanging. And I kind of like this idea that a dream is something that opens out and then it closes once you're awake. So a dream opens out in your unconscious, and I thought of it in the setting of Freud's house as a kind of curtain that could be pulled across at night, and then that would be sort of not evident in the day. And it was really suitable for the subject. But in a larger sense, I really want the work to have a kind of lightness, that it could be a really large scale, it could be monumental scale, but it doesn't have a weight that is really monumental. It matches the lightness of, say, speaking, that it has a kind of quality to it where it can contain a lot of information, but hopefully it seems as though the kinds of conversations that the work is having with the viewer are, a lot of proposals of thoughts or questions. It's not very fixed. And the lightness of the silk really corresponds to that wish that I had to make something that wasn't really heavy and could convey sort of uncertainty and have this sort of almost like a transient sort of sensibility. I think throughout all the work that I make, there is a sort of constant language. There's a set of sort of visuals that carry through all the different types of work that I make. And it's a very particular idiosyncratic thing. I started making the three-dimensional work because I wanted to make physical forms that were of non-physical ideas. I wanted them to be like a drawing so that I could approach it in a very immediate way. So one of the earliest ones that I made was a ghost, because a ghost isn't a physical form. And I put it in an exhibition. I had a one-person show, and I put this three-dimensional figure, sort of a form with a head with grey hair, standing in the space as if I was there when I wasn't there, as if I was haunting the space, or sort of presence. And so I thought of them earlier on as intangible things, that they were always made tangible. And they sort of generally are, like that kind of idea. I think the important part for me is the research part of my process, which means that there's a kind of investigation that happens that somehow contextualizes an otherwise very intuitive sensibility. And that contextualization has a number of times been through an artwork. Like, for example, with the Max Mara Prize, I chose the Gustav Klimt painting 3 Ages of Woman because there was a central figure who was naked, who had grey hair, an elderly figure. And as a very immediate response, I thought, oh my God, she's got the same hair as me. That could be like me in the future. It was a sort of very personal connection. But then I was researching the image and kind of really asking, what does this image mean? What does it say? What's it about, and why am I interested in it? And then I found out that it was bought by the Museum of Modern Art in Rome to celebrate 50 years of the unification of Italy. And that really fascinated me because as an image, it doesn't really seem to fit with, that reason for buying the painting. And then it made me think, in this painting, the elderly woman, she sort of stands naked with her head in her hands as if you can't see her face. It's as if she's ashamed. And I thought, in this case then, maybe the elderly woman represents superstitions, old ways of thinking, old societal structures, connections to nature, old kind of practices that would be suppressed if you wanted to create a modern nation. And because the other two figures are a young woman holding a baby, that seemed to be a very sort of Madonna and child image. And it's as if, you know, that contrast between the sort of purity of the Madonna and child and the elderly figure seemed to be like, you know, this sort of sense of old practices being something you would be ashamed of and suppress. And I thought that's really interesting because right now we're trying to look to these sort of more ancient practices to figure out how to survive and how to move forward. And then that made me think this figure would be a brilliant avatar, almost like a figure who could be very active, and I could use her as a figure who was a survivor in the future. So it kind of built a narrative structure for me. I thought about, well, what would she do if you didn't have anything we rely on, if you didn't have power, you didn't have water, you didn't have, you know, what would you do? And part of my research for the residency was to go and stay on a permaculture site. And I learned a lot about the practices of permaculture, but I realized that there are 12 principles of permaculture and you can apply them to how you live. You know, they're like a sort of philosophy for going about problem solving. So I made an animation called The Trials, in which the elderly figure reperforms the 12 trials of Hercules. And instead of resolving those trials through acts of aggression like Hercules did, by killing or capturing or stealing or whatever, she would approach those problems in a very different way, in a much more caring, kind of considerate way. And so I paired up every trial with a contemporary problem. And then I let the elderly figure kind of think through, you know, how to consider that problem. So she doesn't, it's not like she really resolves it. She just unpacks what the problem is and why it's a problem and how it could be reapproached in order for that problem not to exist in that way. You know, the crises that we face are so evident to all of us. They're so evident every day that they seem to, it's almost as if they have to be in the work because the work is about the experience of being alive. And in that sense, there's a kind of hopefulness, I guess, in the work, that there's a kind of wish to imagine into a future, wish to kind of figure out how to proceed, how to survive, how to keep going. Describing that maybe shows the way I construct, you know, the subjects of the work, that it's a real kind of collage of a lot of different things together that produce a sort of narrative idea. But the narrative is non-linear in the sense that it's not like telling a story. It's a vehicle for asking questions, you know, about our times, about what matters in our times. The really massive kind of issues that really make the terrain, you know, the landscape in which we live.